The Littles, Chapter 8. The Littles were very pleased with the success of Tom's plan. Mr. Little couldn't get over it. I wish you could all seen Tom, he said. Zip, he went right across the floor. It's a mouse, yelled Mrs. Newcomb. Oh my, it was something to see. He's a little all right, said Uncle Pete. He has that little bravery. And only that had a little bravery is right, Uncle Pete, said Tom. I was kind of scared. All the Littles laughed except Uncle Pete. Tom Little, you ripped this mouse costume, said Granny Little. She was looking at it under the light. I'm sorry, Granny, said Tom. I was going so fast I couldn't stop when I got to the other side of the room. I tore it on a nail under the radiator. I'll fix it, said Granny Little. You can wear it next Halloween. I hate mice, said Lucy. Don't wear that thing ever again, please. Granny, you did a wonderful job on the costume, said Mr. Little, but, well, no one really likes it. Do you know what I mean? No sense in wasting all the good work, said Granny Little. She started sewing. We may need it again. I'm not leaving my room until the mice are gone, said Lucy. They'll be gone in a few days, said Mr. Little. You'll see. Everything is going to be all right now. I say, we should see Newcomb, a helping hand, said Uncle Pete. He picked up a sword made from one of Mr. Big's needles. En garde, Uncle Pete limped toward waving the sword and stabbing the air. Take that, he said. So there he has a little sword made out of a needle. Oh, goodness, Uncle Pete. Do put that thing down, said Mrs. Little. I hate to see those weapons around. She turned to her husband. When can we put them back in the chest? As soon as the mice are gone, said Mr. Little. I figure in a few days at most. In the meantime, I want you all to watch out for mouse traps. We don't want any accidents now that our troubles are almost over. Why don't we stay in our rooms for the next few days, said Mrs. Little. Then we'll be safe from the traps and the mice. Uncle Pete didn't think so. We should know what's going on at all times, he said. Bad business sticking your head into the sand like an ostrich. Let's look around once a day then, said Mr. Little. That should be enough. I'm going down to the kitchen first thing tomorrow morning, said Uncle Pete. I want to see those mouse traps with my own eyes. May I go with Uncle Pete this time, said Tom. Lucy doesn't want to go. Do you, Lucy? I'm not leaving my room until the mice are gone, said Lucy Little for the second time. Chapter 9. The next morning, Mr. Little was walking back and forth in the Littles' kitchen. Mrs. Little and Lucy sat at the table watching them. Granny Little was sitting at the table too, knitting. Mr. Little kept looking at his clock on the wall. 10 o'clock, he said, and they're not here. They should have come back a half an hour ago. Who's not here, said Granny Little. Uncle Pete and Tom said, Mr. Little, they went to the kitchen to see if the mouse traps had been set. What shall we do, said Mrs. Little. Mr. Little strapped on his sword. I'm going to find them, he said. They're probably all right, but I can't stand the waiting. I better go with you, said Mrs. Little. No, I can handle it alone, said Mr. Little. I want you here with Granny just in case. Do you think the mice will come here? No, but you can't be sure, said Mr. Little. They did in 35. When there are enough of them, they'll try anything. When Mr. Little got to the kitchen, he couldn't find Uncle Pete and Tom. He didn't see any mouse traps either. He went to the cellar. Still no sign of the boy and his uncle, and there were no mouse traps in the cellar. Something's wrong, thought Mr. Little. Mr. Little went to the garbage can. There had to be mouse traps there. It was the best place to catch mice. But there were none, and still no signs of the missing Littles. It's very strange, thought Mr. Little. No mice, no mouse traps, and no Tom or Uncle Pete. He decided to return to the kitchen. That's where Uncle Pete wanted to go in the first place. So Mr. Little turned back and headed for the kitchen. Meanwhile, back in the Littles' room, Lucy was thinking about her father. Suppose he needs someone to send a message or something. I should have gone with him. She looked into the living room. Granny Little was sitting in her chair by the fireplace. Lucy's mother was watching the door, a kitchen knife in her lap. I should be with my father, thought Lucy. Then suddenly she made up her mind. She ran to her room and got the bow and arrows. Then she slipped out the back door into the passageway. Mr. Little was in the kitchen under the radiator. He waited until he could hear the newcomers talking in the living room. Then he felt it was safe to look around. Near the door to the dining room, he came upon Uncle Pete's sword. Uncle Pete would never let his sword, he thought, unless it was knocked from his hands. Oh, this is bad. I wonder if he put the thought out of his mind. Don't think, he told himself. Just keep looking. Mr. Little drew his sword. He went into the dining room. He kept close to the wall and walked slowly toward the fireplace. Just as Mr. Little was leaving the kitchen, Lucy got there. She saw her father go into the dining room, sword in hand. Lucy ran to catch up. Her father was only a few feet ahead of her when suddenly a giant cat leaped at him out of the shadows. There's the cat. Lucy was never so scared in her life. She ran toward the cat. She ran without thinking. The gigantic animal had attacked her father. She would have to save her father now. The tiny girl came up behind the cat. Its long tail swished back and forth over her head. She took an arrow and jabbed it as hard as she could into the cat's tail. Yow! Yelled the cat, and it ran out the dining room, through the hall, and into the living room. Mr. Little was not hurt. He jumped to his feet. At the same time, Uncle Pete and Tom came running out of the fireplace. They had been cornered by the cat and were hiding under the logs. Let's get out of here, yelled Mr. Little. He ran for the kitchen. Not without this, said Uncle Pete. He bent down and scooped up his sword. The four Littles dashed under the radiator and through the trap door.